Good evening. As the fire gently crackles and the world outside fades into stillness, I invite you to settle in. Let your thoughts float. Let your body unwind. Tonight, we turn the pages of history not with urgency, but with wonder. Beneath the towering legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte lies a quieter story, one of hidden letters, forgotten moments, and truths that never made it into the textbooks. This is not the tale of battles and conquest. This is the story of the man behind the myth, his secrets, his silences, and the shadows he left behind. So close your eyes, let the fire warm your thoughts, and let the night carry you into the untold secrets of Napoleon. Chapter 1. The Corsican Roots. Before the emperor, there was the boy, and the boy was Corsican. The island of Corsica, wild and jagged in its landscape, had always carried the scent of rebellion. It clung to the salty wind and lingered in the tough sinews of the mountain folk who had known nothing but resistance. Against the Genoese, against the French, and sometimes even against each other. This was the soil into which Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, in the modest town of Ajaccio. And though history would call him a Frenchman, he was, first and always, a Corsican. Letizia Ramolino, his mother, was a woman of formidable resolve. It was said that she could hold the family together with little more than silence and a stare. Her faith was worn like an armor, her discipline harsher than the island winds. She bore 13 children, only 8 survived. And among them, it was the second son, small, sickly, intense, who seemed to watch the world with an adult's judgment even before he could walk. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, fancied himself a man of status, although the prestige he sought often eluded him. Trained in law and diplomacy, Carlo was ambitious but inconsistent. He dreamed in French and dined like an Italian, attempting to navigate the precarious social waters of a Corsica newly swallowed by France. His loyalty shifted not out of betrayal, but out of survival. But for young Napoleon, loyalty meant something far different. He was barely 10 when he began keeping a notebook, filled not with childish drawings, but with musings on honor, betrayal, and the stories of great men. He read about Alexander the Great with the hunger of a boy who knew he would not remain small forever. He studied Caesar, Hannibal, and Charlemagne not as distant figures, but as future rivals. Yet he was not yet a leader. Not yet a soldier, not yet the man who would shake the world. He was still a Corsican boy, barefoot more often than not, climbing the rough hills with his older brother Joseph, chasing goats, learning to wrestle and fight in the village square. He learned to be tough, to be proud, and, most of all, to be wary. Corsicans trusted slowly. And so when the French arrived, claiming the island not as a protectorate but as a possession, young Napoleon felt something twist inside him. They spoke a foreign tongue, walked with contempt, and looked upon the islanders as savages. Napoleon, still a child, made a silent vow. One day they would not ignore him. That vow grew in the darkness, in the silence when his brother would sleep and he would stay awake, listening to the wind scratching at the shutters. He would write letters to no one, asking questions he didn't yet know how to answer. Is greatness a choice or a destiny? Can a man serve 2 nations and still keep his soul? He missed his mother when he left for France, though he never admitted it. At the age of 9, he was accepted into the military academy at Brienne-le-Château, a place colder in its manners than its winters. There he was mocked for his accent, for his threadbare clothes, for his Corsican fire. They called him the Little Islander. They mocked his silence. They mocked his pride. But silence, he would later write, is a sword unsharpened until it is drawn. Corsica had taught him many things: how to endure, how to remember, and how to fight even when losing. His loyalty to the island would never fully die. Even as he climbed ranks in the French army, Even as he wore metals and silks, somewhere inside him there still lived a boy barefoot on the rocks, vowing revenge. Years later, when he had become first consul, he returned to Corsica. He walked the streets of Ajaccio not as the emperor, but as a son. Many who had known him as a boy now bowed awkwardly. Some kissed his hand, others simply stared. He visited his childhood home, now purchased and polished by time. He stood in the room where he had first read about Alexander and whispered, "They all thought I was nothing, but Corsica knew better." But the truth was more complicated. Corsica had not always embraced him. In fact, many Corsicans had seen him as a traitor to the cause of independence. He had once supported Pasquale Paoli, the Corsican patriot who fought for liberation. But when Paoli saw that Napoleon's ambition was bound not to Corsican freedom but to French advancement, he turned against him. It was one of the first betrayals Napoleon never forgot, nor forgave. In the quiet of that night, back on Corsican soil, he took out a small, worn notebook, perhaps the same he had begun as a boy. In it he wrote, "I was never French enough for France, never Corsican enough for Corsica. Perhaps that is why I will build an empire, to create a place where I belong." And in that single line, the truth lay bare. The seeds of empire were sown not on the battlefields of Italy or Egypt, but in the quiet, painful ambiguity of a childhood split between two identities. Corsica had given him fire. France would give him the crown. But he never stopped being the boy with the notebook, chasing ghosts through the rocky hills, asking what greatness truly meant. Chapter 2. Secrets at Brienne. They laughed at me because I was different, but I learned to listen in the silence of their laughter. The gates of Brienne-le-Château loomed tall and indifferent, flanked by cold stones and colder stairs. The military academy, founded for the sons of lesser nobility, bore the smell of discipline in its very walls. It was not a place of comfort, but a forging. And among its corridors, a boy from Corsica stepped into a world that was not built for him. Napoleon Bonaparte was 9 when he arrived, his French still tinged with the accent of Ajaccio, his coat 2 sizes too large, and his eyes too sharp for a child. The sons of noblemen who played in gardens and dined on etiquette looked at him as an oddity, a provincial, a foreigner, a poor boy with fire in his bones. They gave him nicknames: La Paillonne, the straw nose, the little Arab, the island rat. He did not forget a single one. But Napoleon had no time for comfort. He studied while others slept. He wrote essays while others sparred. He had already begun forming a philosophy, cobbled from Plutarch's Lives, Rousseau's Contradictions, and the history of Rome. While his classmates memorized drills, Napoleon read about power. One instructor, Father Patrol, saw something unusual in the boy. He once wrote in a report, "He is taciturn, proud, and solitary, but capable of greatness, a volcano under snow." But not everyone saw the fire. Most saw only a strange boy with few friends, odd habits, and too many notebooks. A silent friendship. There was one, however, who looked deeper. Henri Dupont, a sickly, frail boy from Champagne, shared Napoleon's passion for books. He too was an outsider, though for different reasons. One evening, during a rare summer storm, the two found shelter beneath the library stairs. Henri, coughing from the cold, looked at Napoleon and whispered, "They'll never accept us, you know." Napoleon replied without looking up from his notebook, "Then we'll give them no choice." From that moment, an unlikely friendship formed. They spoke rarely in public, but passed each other coded notes. Together, they built a secret society, not of rebels, but of thinkers. They called it the Circle of Fire, though it included only the two of them. Their mission was simple: to understand the mechanics of power. They debated in whispers. What gives a man authority? Can virtue survive in leadership? Is cruelty a necessary instrument? Napoleon kept a ledger, half journal, half manifesto. In it, he wrote thoughts too dangerous to speak aloud. A ruler must love his people only enough to control them. The appearance of justice is more powerful than its reality. Friendship is useful, loyalty is dangerous. Henri, more idealistic, challenged him often. What is the point of power if not to make things better? Napoleon would answer with a slight smile, because if I do not take it, someone worse will. It was in those candlelit hours under the chapel stairs that a new kind of general was born, not a warrior, but a strategist, one who knew that victory was won long before the battlefield. The snow duel. One winter, a mock battle was organized in the academy courtyard, a snowball war between cadets from the southern wing and the northern dormitories. It was meant to be a playful distraction, but Napoleon saw it as a test. He volunteered to lead the southern side. Using the walls, barrels, and crates as fortifications, he directed his peers like a field marshal, assigning squads, designing trenches, even building a miniature snow fortress at the center. The battle raged for hours, more intense than the teachers expected. When it ended, the northern side surrendered, not because of numbers, but because Napoleon had starved them of supply lines, blocking the food and water paths with snow mounds and confusion. A professor muttered that day, "This boy is already a commander." The victory earned Napoleon grudging respect, but no real friendship. To the others, he was still a curiosity, a storm in waiting. The hidden letter. In his third year, Napoleon's world shifted. He received a letter from his father, short, hastily written, and with an undertone of unease. Carlo Bonaparte was sick, and worse, debt was rising. Napoleon didn't cry. He folded the letter once, then twice, and tucked it inside the cover of his notebook. He didn't speak about it to anyone, not even Henry. But that night he wrote, "If I am to be alone, so be it. Let the world fear me if it cannot love me." It was that same year he began writing an unfinished novel, a philosophical story titled Clisson et Eugénie, where the hero is betrayed by society, by love, and by country. The pages, now yellow with time, revealed the early edges of the man he would become. Departure and resolve. In 1784, at the age of 15, Napoleon was selected for the École Militaire in Paris, a great honor. Few from Brienne made the cut. His instructors, despite misgivings about his attitude, could not deny his brilliance in mathematics, artillery, and history. Henri stood at the gate the morning Napoleon left. The two said nothing. Henri only handed him a slip of paper. On it was a quote from Tacitus. "The desire for safety stands against every great and noble enterprise." Napoleon nodded. He never saw Henri again. Years later, as a general, he would quote that line to his troops before battle. Reflection. When asked once by a foreign diplomat what had shaped his mind the most, Napoleon did not mention war or kings or revolution. He simply said, "Brienne taught me the cost of silence." And perhaps in that winter school, among the stones and solitude, the boy had learned not just how to lead men, but how to endure the loneliness of command. He left Brienne not with friends, but with a map in his mind, a blueprint for conquest and for survival. He had learned the most dangerous lesson of all. Power does not come to those who wait. It comes to those who plan. Chapter 3. Quiet in the Revolution. In a time of shouting, the quiet man is the most dangerous. The streets of Paris bled with noise, shouts of liberty, cries of hunger, the grind of guillotines. It was 1793, and France was burning from the inside out. The old world was collapsing, kings, nobles, priests falling like dominoes before the wrath of the people. Chaos wore the mask of justice, and the scent of blood lingered in the wind. Amidst the frenzy, a young Corsican lieutenant walked with careful steps. His uniform was plain, his manner quieter still. Few noticed him. Even fewer remembered his name. But Napoleon Bonaparte was there, in the smoke of the Jacobin rallies, in the whispers of barracks, in the ink-stained corners of revolutionary salons, watching, absorbing, calculating. He did not shout, "Vive la Révolution!" He did not wave a tricolored flag. He watched. The art of observation. To many, Napoleon seemed out of place. He rarely joined the festivities, avoided political debates, and spent more time in the back rows of assembly halls than on the streets. But beneath his silence was a ruthless discipline of the mind. He kept notebooks filled with observations, speeches dissected word by word, names of key figures, diagrams of political alliances. He studied the revolution not as a cause, but as a system, something to be understood like a fortress before siege. "The revolution is a ladder," he once wrote. "Each fallen man becomes a step." While others clung to ideals, Napoleon clung to structure. He admired the audacity of Robespierre, but questioned his logic. He read Rousseau, but annotated the margins with cynicism. "Men are not born free," he scribbled. "They are born with hunger. Whoever feeds them rules them." And so the lieutenant remained in the background, unremarkable to most, indispensable to none. But to those who watched closely, there was something dangerous about his restraint. Letters never sent. It was during this time that Napoleon began writing a series of letters never intended to be sent. Addressed to fictional recipients, they were part diary, part confession, part strategy. He named the imaginary addressee Aurelian, a name taken from a Roman emperor he admired for his discipline and obscurity. "Dear Aurelian," one letter read, "Paris is not a city. It is a fever. The people are drunk on the illusion of power. They do not see how easily it can be taken from them. I study the generals. I study the mob. But most of all, I study silence. It survives more revolutions than banners ever do." Another letter, dated after the execution of Louis XVI, revealed a chilling detachment. "They cut off the head of a king, but they still kneel before flags. What changes? Symbols change. Men remain." These unsent letters were found years later among his personal effects at St. Helena, never meant for the world, but now pieces of the man behind the myth.
Toulon and the rise of precision. In December 1793, Napoleon finally found his moment, not in Paris, but in Toulon, a coastal city held by royalist rebels and British forces. The situation was dire. The Republic needed a miracle. It got Napoleon. At just 24, he was placed in charge of artillery during the siege. While others floundered in confusion, Napoleon mapped the terrain, calculated cannon angles, and devised a strategy that would crush the enemy. He took command of batteries with mathematical precision. His men marveled, not just at his orders, but at the speed of execution. He worked through the night, slept on the dirt, and corrected cannon placements down to the millimeter. When the city fell, generals praised the effort. Politicians took the credit. But those who had seen the siege firsthand knew this was no accident. This was the work of a mind that had waited patiently in the shadows. Toulon made Napoleon a brigadier general, but more importantly, it proved a theory he had long written about in private. Revolutions consume men, but a mind that waits precisely, can consume revolutions. Josephine and the disillusion of romance. In the aftermath of Toulon, the young general was introduced to the salons of Parisian elites. It was there he met Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow of charm, mystery, and fading nobility. She was older, worldly, and fluent in the language of influence. To Napoleon, she was everything he was not:
French by spirit, subtle in speech, magnetic in society. Their romance was not immediate. At first, she amused herself with him, laughing at his Corsican intensity. But something in his letters, his eyes, or his ambition softened her. He spoke little, but when he did, it was as if every word had weight. "You will not always be a general," she once teased. "No," he answered, "one day I will be France." They married in 1796 against his family's wishes. In private, Napoleon wrote, "She understands the revolution better than any Jacobin. She has survived it by becoming necessary, not by being right." Their relationship was a mirror of the revolution itself, passionate, erratic, and destined to be both transformative and tragic. The quiet exit. As Robespierre fell, as heads rolled, as the Thermidorian reaction cooled the bloodlust of the revolution, Napoleon remained intact, not by aligning with factions, but by outlasting them. He understood that in chaos, permanence belongs not to the loudest, but to the most adaptable. He survived the terror by staying useful. He survived the Directory by staying essential. And all the while, he wrote. "I do not need a throne," he wrote in 1795. "I need opportunity. The throne will follow." When asked by a fellow officer why he never joined a political club, Napoleon answered, "Because I am not a follower, and clubs are built for followers." Legacy of silence. In the years to come, many would wonder how this quiet young man from Corsica rose from obscurity to command France. Some credited luck, others genius, but the truth was less romantic and more calculated. Napoleon had listened when others shouted. He had waited when others ran. He had watched when others acted. And when the storm passed, he emerged, dry, upright, and ready. In a world that confused volume with virtue, he had mastered the power of silence.
Chapter 4. The Hidden Lover of Toulon. Some victories leave scars no metal can hide. The wind off the Mediterranean was cold that December of 1793, biting through wool coats and gun smoke alike. Toulon, a vital naval port in southern France, had become a battleground, a symbol of royalist resistance and British intervention. The siege was long, brutal, and desperate. To the Republic, Toulon was a military objective. To Napoleon Bonaparte, it was an opening, a canvas on which he would paint his name in strategy and fire. And yet, Toulon would give him more than a promotion. It would give him a secret he would carry for the rest of his life, a brief, hidden love that would never be recorded in official accounts, but would linger in his private writings and his silences. Her name was Elzéa Dufresne, the woman in the cellar. Elzéa was not noble, nor was she revolutionary. She was a painter's daughter from Marseille who had traveled to Toulon before the siege, caught between cities, between causes, and between lives. When the siege began, she hid in the wine cellar of a bombed villa near Fort La Guillette, surviving on rainwater and dry root vegetables. Napoleon found her by accident. He had been inspecting abandoned estates for artillery vantage points when he stepped into the ruined house. The door to the cellar was ajar. He drew his pistol, expecting looters. What he found instead was a woman, gaunt, defiant, her eyes sunken but unafraid. She did not scream. She stared. "If you're going to shoot me," she said, "do it before the wine runs out." He did not shoot her. A shelter of shadows. Napoleon arranged for Elzéa to be moved to a small, unused room in the officer quarters, hidden from the command structure. Officially, she did not exist. She was registered nowhere, reported to no one. He visited only at night, after long hours in mud and powder smoke. They spoke rarely of the siege. Instead, they spoke of books, of childhood, of regrets. She had read Rousseau and found him childish. She painted landscapes from memory on scraps of cloth. Napoleon, who rarely shared dreams, confessed that he often dreamt not of battles, but of silence. "What do you want?" she asked him one night, candlelight flickering against her soot-darkened cheeks. "Order," he said. "That's not a dream. That's a diagnosis." Elzea did not flatter him. She called his ambitions grandiose. She accused him of hiding behind tactics to avoid confronting pain. She said he feared not death, but intimacy. He didn't deny it. And yet, he kept coming back. Ink and fire. One night, when cannon fire lit the horizon in bursts of orange, Elzea handed him a torn piece of fabric. She had painted on it a scene, a single soldier standing on a cliff, surrounded by waves, looking at a sun that never rose. "Is that me?" he asked. She didn't answer. He tucked it into his uniform. In his notebook, he wrote, "She sees the part of me that I spend my life silencing. What war cannot touch, she touches." The next day, he gave the order to execute a risky maneuver, an assault on Fort Mulgrave. It succeeded brilliantly. The enemy was routed. Toulon was retaken. Napoleon was promoted, a hero. The newspapers printed his name for the first time. But he returned that night to an empty room. Elzea was gone.
The vanishing. There was no note, no sign of struggle, only the small canvas she had once painted, now pinned to the wall with a knife. Napoleon searched discreetly. He sent trusted soldiers to comb the surrounding countryside. Nothing. Some said she was killed in a rebel raid. Others whispered she had been captured by the British. A few suspected she had simply fled, unwilling to be a secret in a general's rise. Napoleon never found the truth. Years later, he would tell his valet in Egypt that Toulon had been both his greatest beginning and greatest theft. The unsent orders. After Elzea's disappearance, Napoleon wrote several letters addressed to a Captain Dufresne. No such officer existed. In them, he spoke of military matters, rivers to cross, cities to take. But each letter ended with a single line unrelated to the rest. "Did you mean to leave?" He never sent them. He folded them neatly and burned them himself. Ghost in the tent. In 1799, during the Egyptian campaign, Napoleon was said to wake suddenly one night, alone in his tent. When asked by his guards if he was unwell, he replied, "A woman was just here. She brought me a painting. I must have been dreaming." But the candle beside his cot was half melted, and in the sand near the tent flap was a single footprint, smaller than a man's. He said nothing more. Legacy without a name. Napoleon never married for love. His union with Josephine was strategic, complicated, and eventually dissolved. His later marriage to Marie-Louise was political to the core. But in the final letters of his life, dictated on the island of St. Helena, he mentioned only one anonymous woman, a southern ghost with eyes like ruin. No one knew who she was. Some scholars have speculated. Others dismiss the references as hallucinations brought on by illness. But in the sealed drawer of his campaign chest, preserved in the Château de Malmaison, lies a piece of faded cloth. On it, a sunless horizon and a lonely soldier. It bears no signature, only silence.
Chapter 5. Egypt and the Mirror of Power. To conquer the East, I had to face the West within me. The wind over the Nile did not blow like that of Corsica or Toulon. It was ancient, dry, vast, and indifferent. Unlike Europe, where history was written in blood each decade, Egypt wore her centuries like stone, heavy, patient, and unmoved. When Napoleon Bonaparte led the Armée d'Orient across the Mediterranean in 1798, he told his men, "Soldiers, from the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." But what he did not say, not even to himself, was what those centuries were reflecting back at him. The veil of conquest. The Egyptian campaign began as a bold stroke of vision. Napoleon wanted to sever British trade to India, expand French influence, and build a new empire in the East. But beneath the geopolitical strategy was something more personal, an urge to remake the world in his image. Upon landing in Alexandria, he declared a strange kind of liberation, not of Egypt, but of his own mythology. He saw himself as Alexander reborn, a Roman emperor in the age of reason, a bringer of order to chaos. He spoke Arabic through translators, issued proclamations praising Islam, and presented himself as a friend of the Prophet. In truth, he neither believed nor disbelieved. He simply calculated. "Faith is a tool," he wrote in his journal. "Power speaks many languages, but it always speaks first to belief." But Egypt did not bend easily. The Mamluks resisted. The Ottomans watched. The people, at first bewildered, grew suspicious. And so Napoleon turned inward. The Mirror of Cairo. At a house commandeered in Cairo, he set up his quarters, an austere room with faded tapestries, old brass lamps, and a solitary mirror made of polished bronze, possibly older than Christ. It was in this mirror each night that Napoleon began to speak to a version of himself no battlefield could silence. He did not recognize the face that stared back, not the boy from Brienne, not the general of Toulon. This man had eyes that weighed empires, but lacked the warmth of dreams. "Who do you become when you become no one else?" he asked aloud one night, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. Sometimes he saw his father in that mirror. Other times Elzea, the ghost of Toulon, flickered in the corners of his reflection, always looking away. But most often he saw power, not as a throne or crown, but as a shapeless hunger, coiled like a serpent inside his chest. The Battle of the Nile, Victory and Illusion. In July 1798, disaster struck. The French fleet, anchored at Aboukir Bay, was attacked by British Admiral Horatio Nelson. In a crushing defeat, most of the French ships were destroyed. Napoleon was stranded in Egypt. Many in the army panicked. Officers questioned the campaign. Morale sank. But Napoleon did not flinch. He held councils, promoted rising talent, and shifted focus from naval defeat to internal reform. "If I cannot sail the sea," he said, "I will shape the sand." He created the Institut d'Egypte, filled it with scholars and scientists. He ordered expeditions into ancient tombs. He promoted French printing presses to flood the streets with propaganda, in French and Arabic. In the face of disaster, he simply created a new reality. And yet, in his private writings, "The Nile mirrors only what I fear to see. My men worship a myth I no longer believe. I speak of glory, but I thirst for silence."
The Scholar and the Spy. It was during this period that Napoleon encountered Jean-Baptiste Venture, a linguist and Oriental scholar assigned to interpret Arabic for the French. But Venture was more than a scholar. He was a secret agent for Talleyrand, sent to monitor Napoleon's ambitions. Napoleon suspected this. Rather than punish him, he invited him for dinner. "What do you think of me?" Napoleon asked between courses. "I think you're becoming more pharaoh than general," Venture replied calmly. "And if I am? Then your pyramids will be built on sand." The next day, Venture was reassigned to Alexandria, alive but silenced. The death of the dream. In 1799, as plague broke out among the troops and resistance in the countryside grew more violent, the dream of Egyptian empire began to rot. Napoleon grew withdrawn. He walked alone at night through the ruins of Memphis. He spoke less to his officers, more to his mirror. He stopped writing letters to Josephine. He began writing to no one. In one unsent letter, later found in his belongings, he wrote, "I thought I came to Egypt to conquer land, but it is I who have been conquered, not by men, not by disease, but by the unbearable clarity of solitude." In August of that year, without warning, Napoleon secretly departed Egypt. He left his army behind. He boarded a frigate and sailed back to France, across waters thick with British patrols, carrying with him no trophies, only revelations. The return. When he arrived in France, he told no one of his inner crisis. Instead, he spoke only of victory, exaggerated and mythologized. The Directory, weak and divided, welcomed him as a hero. The people, hungry for stability, embraced his return like that of Caesar from Gaul. But Egypt never left him. In private, he continued to keep the bronze mirror. It traveled with him through Italy, into the Tuileries Palace, even onto his imperial throne. He never looked into it again, but he never threw it away.
Chapter 6. The Corsican Emperor. I wore the crown of France, but heard the whispers of Corsica. The emperor who was never French enough. On May 18, 1804, in the grand halls of the Tuileries Palace, Napoleon Bonaparte was declared Emperor of the French. The revolutionary republic, born in blood and ideals, had crowned a man born not in Paris, Lyon, or Marseille, but in Ajaccio, a port town on the rugged island of Corsica. As Napoleon stood before the people in his robes of gold and laurel, there was thunderous applause. But deep within him stirred a truth he could not silence. To France, I am always a Corsican. To Corsica, I am no longer one of them. Roots among the rocks. Corsica, the land of his birth, was never far from his mind. Its hills, so unlike the manicured gardens of France, were wild, sun-baked, and ancient. It was a land of vendettas and poetry, of olive trees and gunpowder. Napoleon's earliest memories were not of Versailles or Enlightenment salons. They were of goats in the hills, songs sung in dialect, and his father's uneasy alliance with France, the very nation that had recently conquered them. He learned to speak French only at age 10, and even then with a thick Corsican accent that Parisian aristocrats never let him forget. They called me barbarian, he would recall, even when I wore silk. The island that shaped him. In his private quarters as emperor, Napoleon kept a small weathered stone from a Corsican mountain spring. It had no inscription. To anyone else, it meant nothing. To him, it was the weight of who he was before ambition. He rarely spoke of Corsica in public, but he returned in his dreams, again and again, to a small stretch of coast where he once fished with his brother Joseph. He remembered the day their house was raided by Genoese loyalists. He remembered the scent of the fig trees burning. "They took our island," he once told his valet, "and I swore I would take their continent." And he had. But the island had taken something too, something he could never recover. Pasquale Paoli, the father and the exile. A key figure in Napoleon's early Corsican life was Pasquale Paoli, the great Corsican nationalist who resisted both Genoa and France.
Napoleon once idolized Paoli as a boy until politics turned them into enemies. In his early 20s, Napoleon supported the French occupation of Corsica. Paoli branded him a traitor. Their falling out was bitter and permanent. "He called me a Frenchman," Napoleon wrote, as if it were an insult. Now, as Emperor of France, Napoleon often wondered, "Did I kill my father twice, once in politics and once in memory?"
Corsicans in the court. Napoleon brought several Corsicans into his circle: his brothers, Lucien, Joseph, and Louis, his mother, Letizia, and even minor figures from his youth. But many in the imperial court sneered at them as provincials. Behind the curtains of Versailles, they whispered that the emperor was building a kingdom not of France, but of Corsica in exile. Josephine herself, refined and Parisian, once remarked that Napoleon's family smelled of smoke and salt. He heard it. He never forgot it. The dream of a new Ajaccio. As emperor, Napoleon secretly funded a grand plan to turn his birthplace, Ajaccio, into a shining Mediterranean port. He sent architects, engineers, and materials to build wide roads, marble fountains, and even a naval school. But the Corsicans were divided. Some saw it as an honor. Others saw it as a betrayal, the island remade in the image of the empire. The project stalled. In his journal, Napoleon wrote, "Even my birthplace resists my hand. The stones remember who I was before I crowned myself." An island in the mind. Napoleon's relationship with Corsica was not one of nostalgia, but of torment. He once confessed to a trusted general, "I was never truly French. I became French the way one becomes Catholic, by baptism, not by birth." He ruled France with an iron will, but he ruled himself with fire and ash. Corsica remained in his bones, a reminder of how deeply belonging can cut when it's denied. When he passed Corsica during a voyage to Italy in 1805, he refused to stop. "What would I find?" he asked his aide. "A grave I cannot visit, a youth I cannot reclaim." The Corsican curse. In private moments, he often spoke to his younger brother, Lucien, the most defiant of the Bonapartes. Lucien once asked, "Why do you hide who you are?" Napoleon replied, "Because the world only obeys masks, and mine must be made in Paris, not Ajaccio." But he never truly let go. A Corsican poet later wrote, "He left us as a boy and returned as a storm." And indeed, Napoleon never stood at the front of a church in Ajaccio again. But he sent flowers to the grave of his father every year. The exile foreshadowed. When Napoleon was first exiled to Elba in 1814, many laughed that the emperor of Europe had been reduced to a rock in the sea. But he knew better. He knew that the sea could hold kingdoms of memory. He knew that exile was not always loss. Sometimes it was truth catching up. And when he stood alone on Elba, looking out over the waters that led to Corsica, he whispered to himself in his mother tongue, not French, but Corsu. "Tu sei u foco ci brucia ancor senza fiamma." You are the fire that burns even without flame.
Chapter 7. The Fall Before the Fall. Before empires crumble, the soul collapses first. The high summit of solitude. In 1811, the empire of Napoleon was at its zenith. Stretching from the Atlantic to the edges of Russia, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, France stood taller than it ever had. Statues were erected. Coins bore his profile. Children were named Napoleon in cities he had never seen. Yet amid the parades and proclamations, the emperor stood utterly alone.
His general still saluted him, but now with a careful fear. His brothers grew ambitious and resentful. Josephine was gone, replaced by Marie-Louise, a political bride, not a lover. His court, once filled with energy and movement, had grown sluggish with ceremony. Napoleon, master of the visible world, was beginning to lose grip on the invisible one within. "They kneel before me," he wrote in a private letter, "but I no longer recognize the man they worship." An empire of ice beneath the fire. His military machine, once brilliant in mobility and surprise, had grown rigid with scale. Millions of men fed the war machine. Diplomats seethed in Vienna, London, and St. Petersburg. Alliances were brittle, and yet Napoleon pushed onward. To him, standing still meant death. In the early months of 1812, he began preparing for the greatest gamble of all, the invasion of Russia. Even his closest advisors hesitated. "The Russian steppe swallows armies," warned Marshal Davout. "Then I will feed it one too large to swallow," Napoleon replied. But there was a tremor in his voice that hadn't been there before. The return of the nightmares. On the eve of departure to Russia, Napoleon slept alone in the Tuileries. No aides, no guards. Only a single candle flickering beside a gilded bed. That night, he dreamed of Brienne, the boarding school where he had once stood cold and friendless. He saw the old stone halls, the snow outside, and the mocking laughter of boys, calling him Little Corsican. Then he saw Elzea, the girl from Toulon, her face half in shadow, whispering something he could not understand. And finally, he saw himself, but not as emperor, as a figure in rags wandering an island alone, with only the sea for company. He awoke drenched in sweat. "The future comes backwards," he muttered. "In dreams, truth walks ahead of time." The masks begin to crack. In public, he remained the image of confidence. His army, the Grande Armée, numbered over 600,000 men. No force in Europe could match it. But those close to him noticed changes. His appetite dimmed. He paced more. He avoided mirrors. Once, his valet found him staring at an old map of Corsica, fingers tracing roads long gone. "I've built an empire on parchment," Napoleon whispered, "but I lost the dirt beneath my feet." He no longer read poetry. He stopped visiting the library. He did not ask for letters from Marie-Louise. The machinery of state roared louder, but the man behind it grew quieter. Lucien's last warning. In early spring, his brother Lucien came to visit. Once close, the two had drifted apart over political disagreements. Lucien refused titles, refused to flatter, and it was why Napoleon still listened to him. "You are too far above the world now," Lucien said. "You no longer hear its tremble." "I conquered Europe," Napoleon replied. "Then why do you look like a man who's lost himself?" They argued late into the night. At dawn, Lucien left without ceremony. Napoleon stood by the window long after, watching the sunrise over Paris. "There is no home for an eagle," he whispered, "except the wind."
Prelude to ruin. The weeks that followed were filled with movement, the marshaling of supplies, the crossing of borders, the bending of monarchs to will. But the heart of the empire, Napoleon himself, had begun to falter from within. He second-guessed fewer decisions, not because he trusted himself more, but because he feared that trusting others might reveal how weak he had become. The man who once calculated every hour of his day now wandered corridors alone. In one corridor of the palace, he paused before a large painting of Alexander the Great. "They say he wept because there were no more worlds to conquer," Napoleon murmured. "I wonder if he wept again when he realized conquest could not fill him." Marie-Louise and the silence of love. Though he had taken Marie-Louise of Austria as empress, Napoleon never truly opened to her.
She was kind, patient, and even grew to admire him, but he remained emotionally distant. One evening, she approached him with a letter from their infant son. "He will be a prince the world respects," she smiled. Napoleon only nodded. "Respect," he said, "is the beginning of fear. Love is the end of it." She did not answer. Later that night, he sat in his study and penned a note he never sent. "My son, I hope you inherit the sky, not the sword. I hope you forget me and become your own." A storm waiting to break. By June of 1812, all was ready. The Grande Armée stood poised at the edge of the Niemen River, facing the vastness of Russia. The soldiers cheered, banners flew. But those who stood close to Napoleon saw something different. His hand trembled slightly on the reins. His gaze lingered not on the horizon, but downward, at the dust gathering on his boots. As they crossed the river, the first thunderclouds formed above. It would not rain that day. But history already smelled the storm. The empire does not fall in battle, he told himself. It begins to fall when the emperor doubts his own shadow.
Chapter 8. The Last Island. Before death, the sea becomes a mirror, and the past speaks louder than the wind. The Island Beyond Maps. In October 1815, the man who once commanded Europe stood on the deck of the British frigate Northumberland, watching as St. Helena emerged from the mist. A volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, 1,200 miles from the nearest continent. A place chosen not for safety, but for forgetting. "They have not imprisoned me," Napoleon whispered to himself. "They have buried me before I am dead." The sea thrashed as if mocking his fall. No drums, no banners, only gulls, gray cliffs, and the silence of exile. The Emperor's prison. Longwood House, Napoleon's residence on the island, was damp, wind-beaten, and surrounded by British soldiers. Its ceilings leaked, its windows rattled, rats scurried between walls. But it was not the discomfort that tormented him. It was how small everything had become. He who had redrawn the map of Europe now measured his days in teaspoons, his walks in yards, and his conversations in hours of silence. "At court, I ruled silence," he told one of his few companions. "Here, silence rules me." Companions in shadow. Around him gathered a handful of loyal followers, generals, servants, and a valet named Marchand. They called him sire still. They bowed, they served, but even they began to change. Weeks passed like winters. The only real visitor was memory. He began to write, dictating memoirs, correcting historians, composing letters never sent. He spoke often of Austerlitz, of Jena, of the Code Napoleon. But some nights, when he thought no one listened, he would whisper other names. Elzea, Brienne, Paoli, Josephine. Not commands, not regrets, just names. Like candle smoke, too faint to hold. Conversations with the sea. Most days, Napoleon took walks along the cliffs under escort. There, against the endless blue, his thoughts wandered. "The sea is not my jailer," he once told his valet. "It is my confessor." He spoke aloud to no one, sometimes in French, sometimes in Corsican, sometimes in silence. He asked questions the world never heard. What if I had died at Toulon? What if I had stayed a Corsican poet? Was I great or merely loud enough to be remembered? The illness that listens. By late 1819, his health was visibly failing. Stomach pains, dizziness, fatigue. Some believed it was cancer. Others whispered of poisoning. Napoleon himself no longer cared. His empire was gone.
His son, now called the Duke of Reichstadt, was growing up far away, a stranger to the father who once dreamt of his destiny. "He will know me as myth," Napoleon said, "but never as man." The doctor offered tonics. The British officer in charge offered routine. The wind offered no mercy.
The Secret Chest. In February 1821, knowing the end approached, Napoleon summoned his closest attendants and asked them to bring a small black chest, one that had never left his possession since the campaign in Egypt. Inside were letters, maps, and a faded miniature portrait of a young woman with chestnut hair. "Elzea," he said quietly. "She loved the boy, not the emperor. That is why I never returned." He handed the portrait to Marchand. "Burn this or bury it with me. Let history forget what love once remembered." The final dictation. His final days were slow. He could no longer walk. He drifted in and out of fever. But one morning in April, with surprising clarity, he dictated a final note. "I die before my time, murdered by the English oligarchy and their allies. But the truth is simpler than politics. I burned too brightly, and flame has no patience for peace. Tell my son this: greatness is not conquest. It is how long you can walk with your shadow without trying to escape it." May 5, 1821. At 5:49 p.m., Napoleon Bonaparte died. No trumpets, no last battle, only a deep breath and the sound of ocean wind. As requested, he was buried on the island beneath a weeping willow, without name on the stone. The British feared his legend. His friends feared forgetting. He, perhaps, feared neither. "Write only this," he had once said. "Here lies a man who was never enough for the world and far too much for himself." Epilogue. The shadow that remains. In the decades to follow, Napoleon's body was exhumed and returned to France. Paris welcomed him with music and marble. His tomb in Les Invalides became a shrine. But somewhere out in the Atlantic, on the edge of the world, a breeze still stirs beneath the willows of St. Helena. And if you listen closely, you might hear a voice not of an emperor, but of a boy in Corsica, dreaming of history, and haunted by what it demands in return.
And so, our story comes to a close. A journey that carried us through time, past fading embers, and into memories soft as mist in the night. Thank you for listening, for letting your mind wander through the quiet rhythm of each word. I hope that somewhere along the way you found a little peace, a little reflection, and perhaps a restful sleep. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to follow Tales by the Campfire, where gentle, meaningful stories await you night after night. Sleep well, and until we meet again by the warmth of the fire in the next tale.